A cold strip of light cuts across his suitcase as he smiles like nothing is breaking, and in that suspended moment, the air feels sharpened enough to slice through whatever version of peace we pretended to maintain. The metallic shadow of his watch stretches across the floor, thin and deliberate, as though it has its own intention separate from the man wearing it. I stand near the edge of the foyer, every detail pressing itself into my awareness. The muted hum of the heating vent, the faint scent of his cologne settling over the space between us, the quiet pressure of a house that has watched us argue, reconcile, and now drift into something unrecognizable. He lifts the suitcase handle with a measured movement, and the reflection along its chrome edge flickers against the wall like a signal I'm not yet prepared to interpret. He sets a stack of papers on the table beside him, smoothing the top sheet with an ease that contradicts the weight of its content. I don't reach for them. The moment is too fragile, too loaded, too staged. His voice enters the room with a softness that feels engineered, each word placed gently, carefully, as though he's cushioning the impact of the thing he's about to detach himself from. He says it's not real, that the papers aren't what they seem, that this is just a test, an evaluation of emotional commitment. The terminology sounds clinical foreign to the life we've built and rebuilt. Emotional commitment. As if our years together can be measured on a scale he calibrated in private. I watch him speak, noting the slight upward tilt at the corner of his mouth, that half smile he uses when he wants to seem warm without actually releasing any warmth. The suitcase gleams under the overhead light, revealing every fingerprint he's left on its surface, and I wonder when he last traveled without me noticing. He gestures again toward the documents, but the gesture feels detached, his fingers steady in a way that betrays his confidence in whatever conclusion he's already formed. I shift my attention to the metallic shadow on the floor, the way it bisects the space between us, creating a separation that doesn't require words. There's an unspoken tension hovering, something he expects from me, some reaction he's waiting to measure like a scientist observing a specimen's response to controlled stimulus. The silence deepens, stretching between us like a held breath. Neither of us is willing to acknowledge. I sense him watching me, reading the angle of my shoulders, the stillness of my hands, the controlled neutrality of my expression. My heartbeat remains steady even as the room tilts slightly with the implications of this test he claims is harmless. He frames the idea with language meant to soften it, calling it a moment for clarity, a chance to see where we truly stand. Yet the suitcase's presence suggests another story, one he won't articulate. Something inside the way he shifts his weight tells me he's prepared for departure, ready to move forward with or without my cooperation. He speaks again, using phrases that feel practiced, needing to understand loyalty, wanting reassurance, evaluating the strength of what remains between us. But the words ring hollow, bouncing against the cold surfaces of the foyer, like sounds searching for meaning. I offer no argument, no emotional display, just quiet observation, letting his sentences dissipate into the space above the suitcase. My gaze drifts briefly to the reflection on the table's glossy finish, where the edge of the papers appears doubled. The visual fracture reminds me of the nights when he seemed distant, his explanations too smooth, too symmetrical to be real. Now the fractures seem tangible, etched into the surfaces around us. He moves closer, placing a gentle hand on the paper stack, as if encouraging me to engage. The gesture is subtle, calculated, intended to create the illusion of empathy he's relying on to carry this moment through. I remain still, my voice withheld, my silence forming a barrier more effective than any argument I could assemble. The heating vent releases a low sigh, adding a rhythm beneath the tension. The metallic shadow quivers slightly as he rearranges his stance, catching the shifting light from the overhead fixture. Everything in the room feels aligned against the truth he refuses to speak aloud. The silence grows colder. My eyes meet his, and I search for any trace of uncertainty, some faint flicker that might suggest hesitation or regret, but instead I find only resolve. Whatever this moment is for him, it is already complete. Whatever this test is supposed to reveal, he believes he already knows the outcome. I feel the weight of that understanding settle behind my ribs, a quiet pressure that doesn't break me, but rearranges something inside. The papers remain untouched. His smile remains steady, and I remain still as the edges of the moment sharpen around us, waiting for the reality he refuses to name to surface on its own. The space between us contracts, becoming a narrow corridor of unspoken truths and carefully curated lies. The house listens silent and impartial. The light shifts once more, crossing the suitcase like a final underline. And the moment, fragile and decisive, holds itself taut, waiting for the fracture that is coming. I'm Elise Rowan, 34, an architectural visualization designer from Seattle, Washington. On the morning everything began to tilt, the house felt deceptively ordinary, wrapped in a quiet so familiar, I didn't recognize it as the last moment before the facade started to slip. The kitchen carried the soft scent of fresh coffee steam rising in slow, delicate curls. Light pushed through the window in a thin, angled beam, laying itself across the counter in a silver line that moved almost imperceptibly as the minutes shifted. A glass reflection slipped across the smooth surface, subtle, weightless, barely noticeable. At the time, I didn't read it as anything more than a small decorative gesture the morning offered before work. But looking back, I can trace the tension that lived beneath it, quiet and patient. Damien stood near the sink, his posture composed in that way he always maintained when preparing to introduce a topic he had already rehearsed. His tone that morning carried a precision I should have seen more clearly. He spoke too softly, too steadily, his eyes focusing not on me but slightly to the left, as though aligning his expression in a mirror I couldn't see. He wasn't anxious, not exactly, but contained like someone carrying a conclusion they'd already made. He asked if I had ever doubted us. The phrasing was gentle, intentionally low risk, but something inside it felt foreign, a subtle dissonance humming beneath the ordinary words. I answered honestly with a brief shake of my head and a small smile that felt natural at the time. His eyes flickered at the response, registering something I couldn't decipher. Not relief, not agreement, something else like confirmation of a hypothesis he'd been testing silently. I moved through my morning routine with an unremarkable steadiness. I gathered my bag, checked emails on my phone, and skimmed through a client request about lighting options for an upcoming presentation. Everything followed the rhythm of normal life. But Damien lingered in the doorway longer than he needed to, watching me with a concentration that didn't match the casual question he'd posed minutes earlier. His silence stretched taut and glinting. I felt it but dismissed it, assuming he was weighing something work-related. He often stared into spaces before decisions, silently mapping strategy. I didn't think the strategy might involve me. As I reached for the door, he touched my arm lightly, too lightly, as though measuring pressure rather than offering reassurance. His fingers rested there a moment longer than necessary before he released me. Something in his expression tightened when he saw I'd noticed the hesitation. He masked it with a smile, one of those practiced curves of the mouth that felt warm from afar, but not up close. I returned the gesture automatically, still unaware of the calculus unfolding just behind his eyes. Driving to work, I replayed his question not because it bothered me, but because it felt oddly placed, as if delivered out of sequence. The light on the counter haunted the back of my memory, in a soft echo, that thin reflection slipping just out of reach of meaning. It occurred to me only later how often the truth first appears, as something quiet, barely reflective, almost dismissible, before it eventually builds into something undeniable. The day passed in routine layers. I met with a client who wanted a sharper contrast in their project visuals, redrew a staircase rail in one rendering, and exchanged a few emails with a coworker about a scheduling conflict. Everything seemed grounded, unaffected by the conversation that had started the morning. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind, a faint disturbance lingered, like the small rattle of a loose screw that only becomes obvious once the structure begins to shift. During lunch, I caught myself thinking about Damien's tone again. It wasn't the question, but the delivery. the careful modulation of his voice as if he were reading from a script designed to reveal something specific. I dismissed the thought, focusing instead on the quiet murmur of conversation in the cafe and the metallic clink of utensils against ceramic. When I returned home that evening, he greeted me with an ease that felt slightly too bright. His smile stretched smoothly, but the edges didn't lift the way they used to. He talked about his day with unusual fluidity, stringing together anecdotes and observations without any of the natural pauses that typically marked his recounting. His words flowed like a performance meant to convince me the morning's question was meaningless. As we cooked dinner together, the atmosphere remained calm but tense beneath the surface. The counter's reflection had faded with the shifting light, leaving only a faint memory of its earlier presence. But when I reached for a utensil, the overhead fixture cast a new sliver of brightness across the countertop, a brief silver arc that reminded me too closely of the morning's thin reflection. It felt like a replay, a quiet reinforcement of something I hadn't yet understood. Damien moved behind me, his arm brushing mine lightly. Normally, such contact grounded me, but this time it sparked a strange alertness. Not fear, just an instinctive awareness. He lingered again, his proximity deliberate enough to register. I turned slightly, and he stepped back with a practiced ease, offering a small comment about seasoning, as though filling space with noise would dissolve whatever flickered in my expression. After dinner, we sat on the couch with the soft drone of a documentary playing in the background. His body language remained controlled, too controlled. He leaned back smoothly, his shoulders relaxed, but his eyes flicked toward me more than usual, studying my reactions with a subtle intensity I couldn't categorize at the time. When I finally went to bed, the house felt colder, as though the air held a tension that had settled during the hours we pretended everything was normal. As I pulled the blanket around myself, a thought I hadn't meant to entertain crossed my mind. He was preparing for something he wasn't ready to admit, something he'd already rehearsed in private. The thin reflection on the counter appeared again in my memory, slipping across the surface like a quiet signal I had failed to interpret. It lingered there, suspended at the edge of understanding. Some beginnings don't announce themselves, they whisper. Continue. The first real fracture revealed itself on a night that should have been nothing more than an afterthought. One of those evenings that slips quietly into the week without leaving any imprint. I remember the air carrying a late winter chill, the kind that sneaks into the house no matter how long the heater runs. I reached for the cold doorknob of our office room, expecting the faint metallic bite, but the temperature felt sharper than usual, its coldness pressing into my skin with an insistence that made me pause. It was a small interruption, a subtle alert I nearly dismissed, but I opened the door anyway, stepping into a dim, still pocket of space that felt as though someone had just vacated it. The overhead light was off, but the faint blue glow from Damien's phone washed across the desk in a sterile pool. He rarely left the device unattended. He kept it close the way some people hold on to a secret. So seeing it there, screen lighting the room as though inviting attention, felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. A taut awareness spread beneath my ribs, quiet but undeniable. I took a step closer. The soft hum of the charger made the silence around me even more complete. The screen lit again, flashing a notification preview before fading. I didn't catch the words. Instinct more than curiosity pushed me to touch the display. The home screen blinked open, leading not to messages, not to calls, but directly into a photo folder. A single image sat at the top as if recently accessed. I tapped it. The picture expanded into view, a screenshot labeled Ref. LX12. A street corner I didn't recognize flickered onto the screen, washed in the yellow cast of a dim street lamp. The pavement glistened with moisture, the kind that collects on late-night sidewalks long after the rest of the city falls asleep. And at the top corner, crisp and unmistakable, sat the timestamp 02:17. I stared at it, unblinking. Not because the image was strange, but because the time wasn't possible. That night, just a few weeks earlier, he had been home. He had fallen asleep beside me after a quiet argument that dissolved into exhaustion rather than resolution. I remembered the weight of him shifting in the bed, the rise and fall of his breathing, the change in rhythm as he drifted into sleep. Or at least I thought I did. The image now stood in direct opposition to the memory, introducing a fracture so small, yet so precise it demanded attention. My fingers tightened around the phone. The sterile glow lit the edges of the room, revealing papers stacked too neatly and a stray pen left uncapped. I scanned the rest of the folder, but there was nothing else. No message attached to the screenshot. No explanation, no further context. The image existed alone, suspended without narrative, as though meant to be discovered, but not yet explained. A strange stillness settled over me. My mind replayed that night with startling clarity, the faint shift of blankets, his murmured responses, as he turned the quiet weight of sleep in his limbs. And yet the timestamp told another story, a version where he wasn't in our bed, but on a street corner at 2:17 a.m. I placed the phone back exactly as I'd found it, aligning the edges with the faint ring of dust on the desk. But the cold from the doorknob lingered in my hand, as though carrying the residue of the moment into my skin. The office felt different now, its shadows fuller, its corners sharper. I stepped back, the floor creaking softly beneath me. Later during dinner, Damien spoke casually about an upcoming project review. His voice stayed smooth, untroubled, too consistent. I watched him more closely than usual, noting how he glanced at his phone, with a flicker of something, attention or anticipation, I couldn't tell. When he excused himself to answer a call, he stepped into the hall with the door half closed, not quite hiding the shift in his expression. It was subtle, but every line of his posture seemed to tighten, as though the conversation carried weight he wasn't prepared to share. I sat in the living room, quietly replaying the screenshot again and again in my mind. The timestamp pulsed at the center of my thoughts, like a stubborn heartbeat refusing to fade. I tried to summon a rational explanation. An old photo resurfaced, a mistaken timestamp, a work-related errand he forgot to mention. But the more I searched for a plausible narrative, the more hollow each possibility sounded. The contradiction didn't dissolve. It sharpened. When he returned to the living room, he carried the scent of the hallway's colder air, his movements slightly more controlled than before. He smiled when he saw me, but something in his eyes remained distant, not fully anchored in the present moment. I asked how the call went. He said it was nothing significant, just a colleague confirming a rescheduled meeting. His tone flowed easily, but beneath it I detected a faint tremor, a hesitation so mild it might have gone unnoticed on any other night. But now, with the image fresh in my mind, the tremor felt amplified. As we settled into the evening routine, I caught myself watching the way he navigated the room, how he placed his belongings, how his phone never left his hand again. The memory of it sitting unattended on the desk felt almost unreal now, like an anomaly he wouldn't allow to repeat. He kept the screen angled away from me, subtle but intentional, each gesture performed with the practiced precision of someone familiar with concealment. When he finally drifted off to sleep, his breathing steady and deep, I lay awake beside him. I stared at the ceiling, the faint glow from the streetlights outside, tracing pale lines across the surface. My thoughts circled the screenshot, returning to the timestamp. The unfamiliar street corner, the deliberate way the phone had been left in the office room. The contradictions gathered in quiet layers, forming the earliest shape of a pattern I didn't yet understand. The house settled around us, creaking softly in its usual nighttime rhythm. But the stillness no longer felt safe. It felt watchful. The image ref LX12, 0217, remained suspended at the front of my mind, a quiet fracture waiting for its echo. The lobby of Damien's office building had always unsettled me a little, but that morning it felt impossibly bright, overlit, reflective, a space where nothing could hide, even though everyone tried to. The polished tile floors were so clean they created distorted mirror images beneath every step, doubling people in ways that made it hard to tell where anyone truly stood. I arrived without warning, driven less by suspicion, and more by an uneasy pull that had lingered since the night of the screenshot. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee, a mix that clung to the fluorescent glare. As the doors slid shut behind me, a wave of cool air brushed against my neck, carrying an instinctive reminder that truth often prefers public places for its first reveal. Near the reception desk sat a glass ashtray, an oddly outdated item for a modern corporate building. Its presence struck me immediately. The ashtray's surface carried a trace of smeared fingerprints, as if someone had gripped it recently, hard enough to leave an imprint. The reflection on its curved edge bent the lights above into warped lines that felt like warnings rather than simple distortions. It anchored the space in a strange way, drawing my attention as though it were silently marking the scene I was about to walk into. The receptionist looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. Her greeting trailed off when she recognized my last name. She gestured toward the small lounge area adjacent to the lobby. I followed her line of sight and froze. Damien was there. Not alone. Even before I registered Lena's face, I recognized her body language. Shoulders slightly curved inward, hands clasped in front of her weight, shifting from foot to foot in a way that telegraphed nervousness. Or guilt. They were positioned too closely for a casual conversation, their heads angled together in a way that suggested a private discussion interrupted by my arrival. The moment Damien saw me, he straightened with unnatural quickness. His entire posture smoothed itself like a page being flattened. A bright, brittle smile snapped into place, its edges tight enough to reveal strain. A few feet away, mounted high on the wall, a discreet lobby camera rotated with a low, mechanical click. Its lens tracked the area with a slow, deliberate sweep. When it passed over us, the red indicator blinked, capturing the tension. The sudden silence, the fractured geometry of the three of us caught inside that overlit space. I stepped forward, the sound of my shoes echoing more loudly than I expected. The ambient noise of the lobby faded. Conversations dimmed. Footsteps softened. People nearby pretended not to watch while watching carefully. Damien recovered faster than I anticipated. "Elise," he said, voice wrapped in artificial warmth. "You're early. Early for what?" We had no plans to meet. He knew that. The question slid beneath my skin like a misplaced needle. Lena's eyes darted away from mine, flicking toward the ashtray briefly, before she managed a small, tense smile. "I didn't know you were coming by," she added quickly, her tone light but her jaw tight. She seemed uncomfortable trying to stand at an angle that hid her own expression from the receptionist's line of sight. Her fingers trembled as she brushed a curl behind her ear. The receptionist, sensing a shift worth remembering, pretended to arrange papers on her desk while clearly listening. A middle-aged man in a gray jacket walked past and muttered under his breath something about the tense couple from earlier, not realizing I heard him. He gestured subtly to the receptionist, who nodded, her eyebrows raised in recognition. The moment registered as something she would later recount unofficially, but memorably. Though I didn't know its label yet was forming right there around us. Damien reached out to touch my shoulder, a gesture meant to appear grounding, comforting, supportive. But his hand felt like a misplaced prop, something chosen for an audience rather than for me. His fingers pressed lightly, maybe too lightly, as though he wasn't sure how firmly he was allowed to connect in front of Lena. "We were just discussing a project," he said, "nothing serious." The lie skated effortlessly across his tone. Only someone who didn't know him well might have believed it. But I felt the subtle tension beneath the faint vibration in his words that signaled he was masking something. His smile didn't falter, but the muscles near his temple tightened, betraying the strain of maintaining composure under scrutiny. Lena stepped back, distancing herself physically from the conversation. But the reflection on the ashtray betrayed a tremor in her hand as she moved. The distorted image on the glass caught the twitch before she could hide it. The lobby camera shifted again, the soft whir slicing through the silence. People continued drifting around us, but the moment felt sealed like a scene framed too perfectly to be accidental. I asked a casual question about why he was there so early. His answer came too quickly rehearsed in the way he delivered explanations when he'd already planned them. He said he was preparing for a meeting, yet his tie was slightly askew, and a faint crease at his collar suggested he'd been rushing earlier. Lena murmured something about having another appointment. Her voice carried a thin quiver, and she avoided looking at Damien entirely as she walked toward the elevators. Her retreat felt abrupt, too abrupt for a harmless conversation. As she passed the front desk, the receptionist leaned slightly toward the security guard, whispering something that made him glance over at Damien with a raised eyebrow. Subtle, but unmistakable. Public spaces have a way of storing impressions of generating tiny witnesses in the form of glances and quiet observations. By the time Lena disappeared behind the elevator doors, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. This wasn't just a private tension anymore, there were eyes. There were unspoken judgments. There were fragments of narrative forming in the minds of people who had no stake in our lives, but happened to be present at the exact moment his facade slipped. Damien attempted to steer the conversation toward neutral ground, gesturing for us to move to a quieter area. But the more he tried to redirect, the more the room resisted the shift. It was as if the lobby itself refused to release the truth it had momentarily captured. I asked again softly this time what he was doing there with her. His expression froze for half a second, a minuscule hesitation barely perceptible unless you knew him well. But hesitation in a moment like this was louder than any spoken answer. He laughed lightly, the sound thin, brittle. "Just work stuff, you know how it is." But the space around us disagreed. The receptionist's puzzled look, the man's offhand remark, Lena's trembling hand, the glass ashtray's distorted reflection, the camera recording everything in silent, impartial observation. Evidence number 2 didn't arrive in the form of documents or timestamps. It arrived through the collective awareness of a public place, captured in fragmented witness impressions and casual commentary. A layer of truth revealed not by what Damien said, but by how carefully everyone else tried to pretend they hadn't seen what was unfolding. When I stepped back from him, the lobby felt colder. The reflections on the floor no longer looked like harmless distortions, they looked like cracks. And one truth settled firmly into place. A facade once fractured in public can never be repaired in private. The days after the lobby scene stretched into a strange, brittle quiet, the kind that carries more weight in what it withholds than in what it offers. Our house, the same space that once felt like a refuge after long work days, shifted into something colder, more observational. It felt like a witness, not a home. Shadows lingered too long in corners. Surfaces held reflections that didn't seem to belong to the objects creating them. And every evening without fail, Damien placed his keys on the kitchen counter with a soft metallic rattle that threaded through my nerves like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The trembling key became a presence of its own. I heard it more than I saw it, the faint, irregular vibration, whenever Damien returned from somewhere he claimed was just work. The sound cut through silence, the way a loose shutter taps against a window during a storm, subtle, rhythmic, impossible to ignore once noticed. Sometimes while chopping vegetables or washing dishes, I'd hear the shift of metal on stone and feel an unnamed tension coil inside my spine. I knew the sound shouldn't matter, but it did. It was too deliberate, too expectant, like a reminder placed where I couldn't avoid it. The morning after the lobby incident, I found Damien at the dining table reviewing documents with the kind of calm that felt rehearsed. He greeted me with an easy smile, one I had begun to understand was more of an instrument than an expression. I returned the gesture lightly, watching the way he reached for his coffee mug, without looking away from me, as if measuring my reaction to his nonchalance. He talked about the week-ahead plans he had at work meetings scheduled at odd hours. His words flowed smoothly, each explanation polished and ready. He did not mention Lena. Not a breath of her name crossed his lips, and that silence carried more weight than an admission could have. Later, while organizing receipts for our accountant, the tedious task I always took on, because Damien disliked details, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in a way I felt physically. Receipt number 8821. A late evening purchase, a restaurant I didn't recognize, a timestamp that punched through Damien's narrative with clean precision. The receipt claimed he was dining at 11:43 p.m. The calendar on his phone, something I had glimpsed earlier in the week, listed that night as a late shift. He'd told me he didn't get home until almost midnight. That part was true, but the story around it wasn't. I held the receipt between my fingers, feeling its thin, papery fragility. The printed numbers seemed too sharp, too intentional, like they were trying not just to mark a moment, but to expose it. The address at the top was a place in another neighborhood entirely not even near his office. As my eyes scanned the line again, I felt the floor beneath me tilt, not dramatically, just a subtle shift, enough to tell me that the ground I'd been standing on wasn't solid. When Damien came into the room a few minutes later, he asked what I was working on. His tone was light, almost playful. I lifted my gaze slowly, keeping my expression neutral. My hand closed around the receipt before he could see it. Something in his posture tightened at the sight, just a small change, almost imperceptible. But it wasn't the posture of someone careless or confident. It was the posture of someone alert to the possibility of exposure. I asked him a single question. How late had he worked that night? He didn't miss a beat. Past 11, he said. I told you it was one of those nights. Schedules shifted. I had to cover for a colleague. The answer was smooth. Too smooth. He didn't hesitate or think. He reached for the explanation the way someone reaches for a memorized line in a script. He stepped closer and placed a hand lightly on my arm, offering a rehearsed reassurance that work had been chaotic lately. His touch didn't comfort the way it once had. It felt selective, pressure-adjusted, calibrated. I smiled, told him it was fine, then watched relief pass over his features, like a faint shadow gone almost as quickly as it appeared. After he left the room, I unfolded the receipt again and laid it on the counter. The trembling key rattled as he returned a moment later to grab his jacket, and the vibration wove itself around my thoughts. Two truths discordant but aligned in consequence. He was not where he said he was that night, and he was testing my reactions with a precision I hadn't yet understood. That evening, while doing dishes, the cold window near the sink fogged slightly with each shallow breath. I took the faintest wisp of condensation appearing against the glass. It dissipated quickly, but the moment carried the secondary motif in quiet form. Cold breath, a signal threading itself into the narrative before I consciously recognized it. Damien moved around the kitchen with a deliberate calm, humming softly under his breath. He placed his keys on the counter again. The metal trembled as they settled, sending a tiny vibration through the stone surface. A subtle pulse that seemed timed to coincide with the shift in his gaze toward me. I'll be working late again tomorrow, he said casually. A beat. Too synchronized with the keys settling, too aligned with the patterns appearing in front of me. I nodded wordlessly and dried my hands. He watched me with an intensity he attempted to disguise as curiosity. He was looking for something, an expression, a crack, an emotional cue. But I offered nothing he could use. Later that night, lying beside him, I listened to his breathing. It was steady, predictable, almost tranquil. But it did not reassure me the way it had before. Instead, each inhale sounded like an imitation, an attempt to replicate the rhythm of authenticity. I reached for my phone and pulled up the photo of the receipt, comparing its timestamp with the screenshot of the street corner. Together they formed a pair. Two contradictory images. Two late-night indicators from two different places. Neither one aligned with his story. A timeline fracture had appeared. Thin at first, but widening. I replayed the lobby scene in my mind, the trembling hand reflected in the glass ashtray, the receptionist's nervous glance, Damien's too quick smile, Lena's abrupt retreat. Everything was beginning to align into something larger, something deliberate. Before bed, I placed the receipt in a drawer in my office, folding it carefully and tucking it beneath a folder I rarely touched. Not hidden, but preserved. A small, tangible contradiction waiting for the next piece to land. As I switched off the light, the trembling key rattled once more from the kitchen counter, though no one had touched it. The faint vibration drifted through the quiet house like a reminder, or a warning. The timeline had ruptured, and the truth was beginning to seep through the cracks. Marcus called just after noon, his voice tight around the edges, in a way that made the air around me feel suddenly thinner. He wasn't someone who reached out casually, we barely knew each other, outside brief lobby acknowledgments and a handful of polite nods when I visited Damien's office on rare occasions. So when he asked if I could meet him near the building's maintenance corridor, his hesitation told me everything before his words did. He didn't want to speak over the phone. He didn't want anyone overhearing. Something had shifted, and he was standing close enough to it to feel the danger in its proximity. I arrived 20 minutes later. The maintenance corridor had always unsettled me even before I had reason to question anything. It sat behind a heavy door near the loading bay, washed in the kind of flickering fluorescent light that cast jittery shadows along the walls. The corridor hummed with old wiring and aging ventilation ducts, the sound rising and falling in uneven waves like shallow breaths. As I stepped inside, the flickering bulb overhead pulsed weakly, stretching and collapsing light across the metal panels in fractured rhythms. Marcus waited just beyond the threshold, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. When he saw me, he exhaled sharply, as if relieved I had come, but unsure whether he'd made the right choice involving me at all. "I shouldn't be showing you this," he said quietly, "but something isn't right. And after the lobby incident, well, people notice things even when they pretend they don't." His eyes flicked toward the flickering bulb anxiously, the stuttering light exposing every doubt written on his face. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, its casing scratched from frequent use. He shifted his weight, glancing nervously down the corridor before continuing. "It's the footage from camera C07, he said. "The one covering the east entrance, the night Damien said he stayed late for work." My heartbeat steadied, not faster, not slower, just heavier, as though preparing itself. Marcus handed me a small handheld player barely bigger than his palm. The screen glowed faintly as he powered it on the flickering bulb above us, splitting its weak light into several thin lines across the device. My fingers brushed the screen when he passed it to me, the cold plastic grounding me in the moment. He pulled up the footage and pressed play. A grainy nighttime view appeared, the east entrance framed by a narrow awning pavement, damp from recent rain. The timestamp in the lower right corner flickered in and out of focus. For several seconds, the image held steady, just a quiet stretch of empty walkway, illuminated by a buzzing streetlight. Then the light overhead flickered, and the motif echo dropped into place like a blade finding its groove. The reflection splits as the timestamp fails. It happened quickly, almost too quickly to catch without expecting it. The light fractured into two thin, wavering lines across the screen, bending the image just enough to distort the moment. Simultaneously, the timestamp froze, 02:13:57, before stuttering violently and jumping forward several seconds in a sudden glitch. 02:14:07. 10 seconds gone. Clean, silent, unexplained. It wasn't a camera malfunction. At least not the kind that happens naturally. "This isn't normal," I whispered. Marcus nodded. "Exactly. Cameras glitch, sure, but they don't skip time without a reason. And this one? Well, someone accessed the system the next morning. Logs show a manual override, not by security. Someone used an external credential." He swallowed hard. "Someone with access to the internal network. but not necessarily someone officially allowed in the footage archive. His implication hung heavy in the flickering light. "Damien," I asked quietly. Marcus didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. I watched the footage again, and on the third loop, I noticed something else. Just before the timestamp froze, a faint silhouette appeared at the edge of the screen. Not a full figure, just the corner of a shoulder or arm moving quickly, half obscured by the camera's limited angle. And then, just as the glitch hit, the figure vanished. My chest tightened. Has anyone else seen this?" He hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but the override credential, it matches one used in the HR wing, and I know Damien has access to that floor." My thoughts snapped instantly to Caroline, to the rain-wet sleeve, and the quiet concern buried behind her professionalism. Something was unfolding across multiple levels of that building, and Damien stood at the center of it. As I watched the footage one more time, the flickering bulb above us pulsed violently, casting fragmented shadows along the wall. The fractured light stretched across Marcus's face, splitting it into sharp contrasts. "He didn't come home that night when he said he did," I murmured. "Not the way he claimed." Marcus's expression shifted, something between sympathy and fear. "I don't know what's going on," he admitted, "but I thought you should see this before anyone else tries to bury it. And trust me, they will." The footage froze again on the skipping timestamp. 02:13:57. Glitch 02:14:07. 10 missing seconds. A silence where a truth should have been. The reflection splits as the timestamp fails. The motif echoed through the dim corridor like a quiet verdict. When I stepped back out into the brighter hallway, the cold air felt sharper, more deliberate. The world outside the maintenance corridor looked deceptively stable, but something foundational had cracked beneath it. I understood with sudden clarity that nothing from here would remain small. The fracture had deepened, and the next rupture would not be subtle. Caroline reached out the next morning with a message so formal it tripped every internal alarm I had learned to trust. She wasn't someone who contacted employees' spouses directly, not unless something had gone wrong in a way the company couldn't ignore. Her request was simple on the surface: could we speak privately about a clarification regarding Damien's recent schedule? But beneath the politeness, every word felt sharpened. Purposeful. Controlled enough to avoid suspicion if read by the wrong eyes. Careful enough to signal urgency if read by the right ones. I replied that I could come by within the hour. She responded instantly, as though waiting. The weather had shifted by the time I arrived. A thin, cold rain fell in soft needles against the pavement, soaking through the edges of my sleeves before I reached the entrance. When I stepped inside, the main lobby buzzed with its usual weekday energy. But there was something taut beneath it, an undercurrent of tension humming around certain faces. Conversations paused when I crossed the space. Eyes flicked away too quickly to be comfortable. The memory of the lobby scene lingered in the air, like an afterimage no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Caroline waited near the east hallway, standing beneath a wall-mounted lamp, whose glow looked unnervingly similar to the flickering bulb from the maintenance corridor where Marcus had shown me the footage. Her posture held the crisp precision of someone who spent years absorbing the details of workplace behavior and learning to read the emotional temperature of a room before stepping fully inside it. As I approached, she offered a small, polite smile, professional, but not distant. Her coat sleeve darkened and rain-wet brushed lightly against her hip, leaving small droplets across the tile. She gestured for me to follow her down the hallway, away from the noise, and toward a quieter, narrow corridor, used mostly by staff. "Thank you for coming," she began, voice level, but carrying a faint strain. "I wanted to speak about a few irregularities in the schedule records involving your husband." The phrasing hit with quiet force. Irregularities. Not errors, not misunderstandings. Irregularities meant someone had altered something, or someone's story didn't align with the system's truth. We stepped deeper into the hallway. The overhead lamp flickered once, not as dramatically as the maintenance bulb, but enough to cast a small, stuttering shadow across the floor. Light fractured briefly, splitting into thin lines, a soft echo of what I'd seen before. Caroline opened a folder she'd been holding the paper inside, shielded from public view, until we were tucked between two empty office rooms. "I'm sharing this with hesitation," she said, lowering her voice, "because I'm not certain how far this extends. But your name appeared during a routine check and, well," she paused, gathering words she wasn't supposed to say. "You deserve clarity." She handed me a printed email, Ref S14, a scheduling notice listing Damien's shifts for the past month. Several entries didn't match what he'd told me, and more importantly, they didn't align with the timeline implied by Marcus's footage. The first discrepancy jumped immediately off the page. A shift Damien claimed to have worked until midnight 1, he insisted was exhausting, was marked as completed at 8:45 p.m. Another night, the logs suggested he wasn't scheduled to be in the building at all. Yet I knew he had left the house around dinner, claiming unexpected overtime. The lines tightened around the truth like a net pulling inward. "Is this correct?" I asked. Caroline nodded once. "That's what concerns me. I keep precise oversight over schedules. I know who's authorized in the building at any given time. These adjustments weren't made by me." A chill crawled beneath my skin. "Who altered them?" Her answer arrived in a quiet exhale. "Someone from the internal network. They used a shared credential from the HR wing. It's not tied to a single person, which complicates this. The same type of credential Marcus mentioned. The same wing Damien had access to. Coincidence dissolves when it appears twice in the same place." Caroline studied my expression carefully. "I don't know what's going on, but there's something else you should see." She flipped to another page. A timestamp, a visitor log, a single line L. Morrison, 9:12 p.m., accessed east entrance. My heartbeat slowed harder and deeper. "Lena," Caroline continued, "her presence at these hours doesn't align with her role. She's not cleared for access to that section of the building. No appointments, no records of her assisting any department. Yet, she appears multiple times." I felt something inside me shift, a quiet, steadying internal click, like a gear finding its rightful notch. "She was here the same night Damien claimed to be at work late," I said. "The same night he said he couldn't answer his phone because he was in a long meeting." "Yes," Caroline swallowed. "And the camera logs near that entrance? Someone tampered with them. I don't know who. But it happened shortly after she left." Her eyes held a mixture of apology and unspoken warning. I don't want to assume anything she said, but I've been in HR a long time, and I've seen patterns that start like this. When logs change without explanation and people appear where they shouldn't, something's being controlled or hidden. She hesitated. "Or someone is setting up a narrative." The hallway felt suddenly narrower, the air heavier. The muted sound of rain against the building exterior filtered faintly through the vents, and for a moment the cold scent of damp air traveled the corridor, echoing the chilly imprint her rain-wet sleeve had left on my wrist earlier when she handed me the papers. One small grounding reminder that reality was happening in layers, the visible, the hidden, and the manipulated. I scanned the document again. Each line felt like a small blow against a foundation I had already suspected was unstable. But instead of collapsing, something in me solidified. Clarity, not panic, took hold. Caroline stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever this is, be careful. People who adjust timelines tend to escalate when they feel cornered." She let that settle, then straightened her posture, her mask of professionalism sliding back into place just as footsteps approached far down the hall. She handed me the printed schedule and the secondary log with Lena's entries. As she pushed the folder gently into my hands, the overhead lamp flickered again, throwing a jagged shadow across the wall, a thin, twisted line that stretched briefly before stabilizing. "You didn't hear this from me?" she said quietly. "I understand," I replied. She nodded once, then stepped away, her rain-wet sleeve leaving a faint chill in its wake. I stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, studying the papers. Evidence number 5. Not explosive, but essential. The subtle piece that connected Damien's lies to a pattern of access manipulation and presence. A thread tying him to Lena in a way no conversation could explain cleanly. I exhaled slowly. The fracture wasn't a fracture anymore. It was a widening fault line, and the map leading through it was finally visible. As I walked out of the building, the rain met me again, cold, insistent, cleansing, in a way I hadn't expected. The wind pressed damp air against my face, carrying a quiet understanding. Something far larger than a test was in motion. And I wasn't the only one who sensed it. The tension in our house didn't rise. Suddenly, it accumulated the way cold gathers in unheated corners, slow enough to overlook, until it settles into your bones. Damien had grown quieter over the past week, but not in a way that suggested reflection or remorse. It was the silence of calculation, the hush of someone rehearsing the next version of a lie before offering it as truth. He moved through rooms as if they belonged to him alone, as if the air were calibrated to his breath, and I were merely passing through it. Something in him had shifted after the lobby scene, and something in me had shifted after Caroline placed those documents in my hands. Neither of us acknowledged the change directly, but the space between us noticed, and it waited. His behavior tightened like clockwork. He woke earlier, returned later, offered explanations with edges too clean to be sincere. Even the way he placed his belongings seemed orchestrated. His phone, normally glued to him, like an extra limb, now disappeared into pockets the moment I stepped into a room. His voice grew more careful, his movements more controlled. And each night, when he slipped his keys onto the counter, the faint metallic rattle seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension. It was on a night heavy with that tension that I discovered the half-open drawer. I wasn't looking for anything. I'd only gone into his small study to retrieve a notepad I had left there earlier. But as the door clicked softly behind me, I noticed the drawer on his desk pulled out at a slight angle open just enough to be noticeable, but not enough to appear intentional. Damien wasn't careless with anything he owned. He didn't leave things half-finished or half-open. His precision was a defining feature, a pattern so deeply ingrained that this deviation felt deliberate only in retrospect. The drawer's position revealed a sliver of its contents. A recording device, small, black, sleek, no larger than a deck of cards. A faint red light pulsed slowly on its surface. My breath stilled. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The presence of the device alone carried meaning. It wasn't a tool someone kept casually, not unless they had reason to archive conversations, to track movement, to capture things that shouldn't be lost. I stepped back, closing the drawer gently until it sat flush with the wood. The soft click sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. Later that night, Damien returned home with the same practiced ease he had been using for days. He smiled at me in the kitchen, the corners of his mouth lifting with mechanical precision. His fingers brushed mine when he reached for a glass, and the contact felt hollow, as though the man I married were performing a role he had rehearsed with someone else. "Long day," he murmured. The words didn't match his eyes. Nothing about him aligned anymore. Not his expressions, not his tone, not the way he held himself slightly differently, depending on which light he stood under. He was performing multiple versions of himself, each tailored to a different moment, a different expectation. Something had fractured inside him too, but unlike mine, his fracture didn't make anything clearer. I watched him move through our kitchen with his usual efficiency, but everything he touched felt tainted with an undercurrent of concealment. When he reached for his phone, the screen lit up briefly, bright enough for me to see the glow reflected on the countertop. And then he turned the device away from me too quickly to be casual. That was the moment my phone vibrated in my pocket. An unknown number, no text, just an audio file. When I opened the message, a single attachment stared back at me. A17. Wave. My fingertips tingled with the same cold anticipation that had followed me through every discovery so far. I played the clip in the privacy of my office, with the door closed and the lights dimmed. Static filled the first second. Then soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed against a smooth surface. A low breath followed, quiet enough that I wondered if the microphone had been hidden or pocketed. And then Damien's voice emerged, muffled but unmistakable. He wasn't speaking clearly enough for me to decipher the full sentences, but the tone the soft, intimate murmur carried, familiarity twisted into something else, something wrong. But it wasn't just his voice. Another presence breathed near him, a softer voice, a faint shift, a small laugh caught underneath a breath. Lena. I didn't need clarity in the words. The cadence was enough. The proximity of their voices was enough. And the timestamp embedded into the file 1904 landed like an iron weight inside my chest. 1904. The exact time Damien and I had been sitting across from each other at the restaurant several weeks earlier. The night he insisted on a spontaneous dinner date, a night I had found charming in the moment, a sudden urge for connection I'd taken as a sign of us finding balance again. He had been with me at that time, and yet he was somewhere else as well. 2 timelines, one false, one real, and the audio clip carved a clean, unforgiving line between them. I replayed it again and again. And on the 4th listen, I caught something nearly lost beneath the ambient noise, a faint hum in the background. Not from the restaurant, not from our house, not from anything familiar. I couldn't place it, but the sound carried the resonance of a location where voices echoed against hard surfaces the way they did in stairwells or empty hallways, or maintenance corridors, or restricted areas of an office building. My heart drifted toward recognition before my mind allowed it. But the clarity settled with a quiet finality. He had been in the building. With her. During the time he was with me. The contradiction wasn't just a fracture. Now it was a tear wide enough to fall through. When I stepped out of the office, Damien was standing at the kitchen counter staring at his phone. He didn't notice me right away. His shoulders held tension, his posture too straight. He looked like someone anticipating impact, someone bracing for a truth that might strike from any direction. Without turning, he slipped his phone into his pocket, an action so fast, so instinctive, that it confirmed what I already knew. He was hiding something. Or everything. "Are you okay?" he asked when he finally noticed me. The question sounded genuine. It wasn't. It was a temperature check, a reaction test, another assessment for his unspoken experiment. I nodded gently, calmly, neutrally. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, not fear, not guilt, but uncertainty. He couldn't read me now, and the realization unsettled him. Good. I walked past him, letting the calm in my voice carry a quiet truth. Whatever he thought he controlled, he no longer did. That night, while he showered, I sat in bed reviewing everything: the screenshot, the receipt, the witness remarks, the schedule discrepancies, the CCTV gap, and now the audio clip. Every piece formed a lattice that pointed towards something meticulously constructed and deeply deceptive. The half-open drawer, the recording device, the 2 overlapping timelines, the presence of another voice beside his. The facade he had built wasn't just cracked, it was collapsing under the weight of its contradictions. I lay back on the pillow, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling the shift inside me settle like cold air into a sealed room. He thought he was testing me, measuring me, evaluating my reactions for a purpose he believed only he understood. But the test wasn't his anymore. The truth was aligning. The evidence was stacking. The fracture had become a fault line, and the next step would break it open completely. The house felt different by then, less like a home, and more like a container holding 2 bodies that had begun orbiting separate truths. We moved around each other in quiet patterns, our routines synchronized only in appearance. Damien brewed coffee in the mornings. I prepared my work bag. We exchanged brief hollow comments about weather or errands. But beneath each word lay tension so taut it hummed through every room, vibrating the silence like an instrument tuned too tightly. By the time I reached the point of assembling the digital logs I'd been keeping, the structure of his deception was already visible, bare outlines, becoming a shape. I didn't begin documenting his odd inconsistencies out of paranoia or suspicion. Not at first. They had started as scattered notes, timestamps, phrases, unexplained absences, things I recorded simply because they bothered me. But now, as I opened the folder labeled D9 on my laptop, every entry felt like a rung on a ladder climbing toward certainty. Log number D9 was the most damning. Weeks of repeated absence times. Each listed without accusation neutral observations. 1:17 a.m., returned home quietly. 12:54 a.m., claimed shift change. 2:40 a.m., no explanation offered. But the repetition was the revelation. A silent rhythm of nights where he had not been where he said he was. A pattern aligning too perfectly with the screenshot from 0217, the missing 10 seconds in the CCTV, the schedule discrepancies, and the audio file timestamped 1904. He thought he'd created a controlled narrative, something he could manipulate without consequence. But his mistakes, small fissures he never imagined I would connect, had formed a single undeniable structure. As I scrolled, the faint glow from the desk lamp illuminated the edge of a paper near my elbow. Its corner caught beneath my nail, creating a thin, stinging slice across my skin. The paper edge left a line so sharp and precise, it forced a small inhale. The sting grounded me, reminding me I was here in this moment, standing on the edge of irreversible truth. It felt fitting, a clean, cold line mirroring the emotional cut forming between us. I spent the next hour reviewing the logs, comparing them to the timestamps Caroline had shown me, then cross-referencing with the faint hum in the background of the audio clip. Every piece fit. The more I aligned them, the more coherent the timeline became. It wasn't chaotic. It was orchestrated. Damien had been constructing an alternate truth while assuming I would remain too trusting or too distracted to question the inconsistencies. He wasn't sloppy, just arrogant. The click of the front door broke my concentration. Damien stepped into the hallway with an air of tension wrapped too tightly for him to disguise. He set his bag down slowly, his movements precise, too precise. When he entered the room, his eyes scanned my face before landing on the laptop, reading the shift in my expression, even though I tried to mask it. "You're working late," he said lightly. The comment didn't fit the moment. It was a script line, something he used to initiate normalcy when he sensed something was off. I turned the laptop slightly enough to close the screen without appearing abrupt. I had things to catch up on. He watched me for a beat too long. His gaze wasn't affectionate, it was evaluative. He was checking whether he still had control over the emotional temperature of the room. But something in my stillness unsettled him. He stepped closer, his voice slipping into that soft tone he used when trying to guide a conversation. "Are you all right? You seem distant." I offered him a small smile. Calm, neutral, controlled, the very expression he could never read clearly. "I'm fine," I said, "just thinking." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to not understanding me. For years he relied on my transparency, my instinctive honesty. But now my neutrality created a barrier he couldn't penetrate, and he felt it. His shoulders stiffened just slightly, a reflexive defense against unpredictability. He changed the subject quickly, asking if I wanted tea, if I'd eaten, if I wanted to watch something together. None of it sounded genuine. It was stalling, probing for cues, attempting to gather information through my reactions rather than through direct questions. He circled around me conversationally, searching for a crack. But I remained unreadable. As he busied himself in the kitchen, the rattle of his keys echoed from the counter. A small metallic quiver. Not loud, but deliberate, like a reminder or a deflection. The sound slivered through the quiet moment, joining the larger mosaic forming around us. When he returned, his expression carried the faintest edge of something I hadn't yet seen: frustration. Not overt, not dangerous, just controlled pressure building beneath his mask. He asked again if everything was okay, and I answered with the same quiet poise. "Things are fine," I repeated softly, but the calm in my voice made something flicker in his expression, something that stripped away for just a fraction of a second the smooth confidence he'd been holding on to. He could feel the shift. He could feel the balance tipping. He could feel the narrative slipping away from him. Perfect. I excused myself and returned to my office, leaving him standing in the kitchen under the sharp overhead light. I didn't look back, but I heard the silence behind me shift the subtle sound of him steadying his breath. When I sat back down, I reopened log num D9, letting the pieces settle into place in the quiet room. My decision crystallized. I wasn't ready for confrontation, not yet. Confrontation without leverage would give him room to twist the story, regain control. He relied on emotional imbalance, so I would give him none. I needed one more piece. The final thread that would bind the entire structure of his deceit into something undeniable. He was cornered, but he didn't know it yet. And I wasn't going to force the collapse. I was going to let him walk into it. Silence is a verdict. And the verdict was coming. The truth arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet glow, an accidental pulse of light across a dark room. It was late. Damien had already retreated to the shower, steam seeping through the crack beneath the bathroom door in slow, ghost-like curls. I sat on the edge of the bed reviewing log num D9 again, letting the rhythms of his deceptions settle into a pattern I could finally see clearly. But even then, even after the screenshot, the receipt, the public scene, the tampered footage, the altered schedules, the rain-wet sleeve, the audio file, something still hovered just beyond reach. A final motive. A reason. A center of gravity the rest of his lies orbited around. It emerged the moment his phone lit up on the dresser. The glow was faint at first, a soft square of blue shimmering across the hardwood floor, stretching up one leg of the bed frame, like a hand reaching for my attention. I wouldn't have looked if it hadn't vibrated again. And again. 3 small pulses of light, too rhythmic to be accidental, too insistent to ignore. I stood slowly crossing the room with measured steps, the silence thick enough to feel against my skin. His lock screen flashed with a notification preview. Just a hint, just enough, drafts 1, a folder he never left open. My pulse settled into a cold steadiness. I lifted the phone carefully, angling it toward the lamp, letting the glow illuminate the device in a narrow amber half-light. As soon as I unlocked it, the screen opened directly into the drafts, as if the last thing he'd done before stepping into the shower was prepare something he wasn't ready to send. Draft Ref RQ1. The subject line held a chill I didn't expect. Re-final evaluation. The words below it read like a report. Not a message to a partner, not an apology, not even a confession. A report. I scrolled. I believe the test reached a point of diminishing returns. She shows consistent loyalty markers, but intermittent hesitation. Emotional compliance remains high, though unpredictability has increased in the last week. If alternate support remains necessary, transition may proceed. LM demonstrates predictable emotional alignment and may serve as contingency. Every word sliced through the air with clinical precision. LM. Predictable emotional alignment. Contingency. Cold language. Detached. Technical. As though he were describing 2 pieces in a system, evaluating which one would operate more consistently under pressure. Not partners. Not people. Components. I scrolled again, reading the next paragraph. I will introduce the dissolution papers by Friday. The frame remains a harmless test, and she has responded within acceptable parameters. Further deviation may expose the secondary structure. I will initiate final separation if compliance drops below threshold. The breath that left my body didn't feel like a reaction, it felt like a decision. A shift. A sealing. The final piece had clicked into place. Not suspicion, not ambiguity, but clarity. He had planned everything, calculated everything, measured me, configured me, ranked me next to someone else, and framed the divorce papers as a psychological experiment to evaluate my emotional compliance. My skin tingled with a cold, steady calm. Not shock, not hurt, but understanding so exact it felt like precision. Then another line. If the test fails, proceed with alternate plan. She is not aware of the secondary timeline, though she may be sensing discrepancies. Maintain rehearsed affect until evaluation concludes. Rehearsed affect? Affect, like an actor. Like someone trained to simulate warmth without producing any. I scrolled to the bottom where the last sentence sat alone, unpunctuated. Do not underestimate her. The phone vibrated again. A new notification slid across the screen, draft auto-saved. And then the bathroom door clicked. I returned the phone to its exact position, not a millimeter off, just as the water shut off. The light beneath the door flickered with his movement. My heartbeat remained steady, almost artificially calm. This wasn't a test. It had never been a test. It was an evaluation he had engineered long before the conversation in the kitchen, long before the reflection slipped across the counter, long before the screenshot appeared. He stepped out, wrapped in a towel, hair-damp steam trailing behind him. The overhead light caught droplets along his shoulders, turning them into small glints of silver. He looked relaxed, too relaxed. Still awake, he asked softly. His voice wasn't warm, it was measured, practiced. Affect calibrated to the situation. I nodded, just thinking. He smiled, stepping closer. The movement was fluid, controlled, exactly like the notes in his draft had described. He wasn't aware that the dynamic had shifted, that the structure he'd built around us had dissolved the moment his own words, betrayed him. He sat beside me close enough that the warmth from the shower radiated against my arm. He tried to lace his fingers through mine. A habitual gesture, a scripted one. I let him. Not because I wanted the contact, but because I wanted him unaware, unprepared, unbalanced. "How was your night?" he asked. The question was harmless in tone, but not in intention. He was testing. Always testing. It was illuminating, I said. He didn't notice the weight of the word. He didn't notice the calm in my voice wasn't submission, it was strategy. He didn't notice anything beyond the role he expected me to play. He leaned back against the headboard, exhaling in a way that signaled he believed he was still ahead, still controlling the narrative, still writing the script. But the script had turned, and he didn't know it. As he closed his eyes, his breathing even and confident, I glanced once more at the phone light reflecting off the dresser, its glow pale and steady, illuminating the truth he never intended me to find. Evidence number 8 wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was methodical, cold, precise, and it revealed everything. The truth didn't break me. It anchored me. Because now finally I knew exactly what he was, exactly what he intended, exactly what came next. The evaluation was over, but mine had just begun. Morning arrived without asking permission. Light seeped into the bedroom in a thin, hesitant beam, touching the edge of the nightstand, before spreading across the floorboards like a quiet approach. I sat upright before the alarm sounded, the room still wrapped in the silence that follows a turning point. Damien slept beside me, his breathing slow, steady, untroubled, unaware. He had no idea that the structure he built in secret had already collapsed. He had no idea that I had seen the draft read, the evaluation, recognized the language of control he hid inside clinical terminology. He had no idea that the moment his own words revealed his intentions, something inside me had shifted into place with clarity he would never reclaim. I rose from the bed, carefully pulling the blanket aside without disturbing him. The air was cold against my skin, sharpened by the residue of last night's reveal. On the dresser, a shard of mirror from a frame that had cracked weeks earlier still lay where I'd placed it. I lifted it now, holding it between my fingers. The morning light struck its jagged edge, sending a sliver of brightness across the room, a fractured gleam that split into two thin lines before dissolving softly. Not dangerous, not threatening, just reflective enough to remind me of how easily something can break and still offer clarity. I set it on the table beside the couch in the living room, arranging the surface for what needed to happen next. Every piece of evidence, each contradiction, each timestamp, each fractured reflection had been placed in order the night before. 8 pieces total. The architecture of his deception mapped out with the same precision he had once admired in my work. The screenshot, the public witness account, the receipt, the flickering CCTV footage, the scheduling discrepancies, the audio clip, the digital logs, the draft. Each one waited calmly, silently. Facts don't tremble the way people do. I made coffee, letting the quiet routine anchor the moment. The house, so tense in recent weeks, seemed to hold its breath. As the scent of coffee drifted through the kitchen, Damien emerged from the hallway, running a hand through his damp hair. His expression was composed, almost warm, reinforced by whatever version of himself he'd chosen to present this morning. He smiled when he saw me, and it was the same smooth, practiced expression I had watched him use on others. A constructed smile, an engineered affect. "Morning," he said lightly, stepping closer. I nodded, motioning toward the living room. "Can we talk for a moment?" The shift in my tone, calm, even unthreatened, made something flicker behind his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to calculation. He followed me into the room, unaware of what waited on the table. When he saw the arranged papers, he paused. His face stayed neutral, but the stillness in his shoulders betrayed a quiet tension. His gaze moved from the screenshot to the receipt to the CCTV image. His fingers twitched slightly just once before he steadied them. "What is this?" he asked, his voice measured. Everything I said, simply. He didn't pick anything up at first. He didn't need to. The arrangement told the story on its own. The timeline lay bare between us, dissected and undeniable. For a moment, he said nothing at all. Just stood there, his expression flattening into something blank. A mask stripped of its purpose. I began with the screenshot. 02:17. The street corner lit by a single lamp. The night he claimed he slept beside me. His jaw tightened. Then the witness statement. Statement number M4. The man in the lobby remarking about the tense couple. The receptionist's confirmation. The subtle public fracture he'd tried to smooth over with a smile. The receipt. 11:43 p.m. A restaurant far from his office. A night he said he covered for a colleague who needed him late. The CCTV footage. The glitch. The 10 missing seconds. The split reflection. The timestamp jump he couldn't rationalize without revealing the credentials he'd used to override the system. The scheduling email from Caroline. The unauthorized changes. The entries that aligned with none of his explanations. The audio clip. 19:04. His voice. Her voice. The overlapping timelines. The hum of a hallway outside its usual access hours. My digital logs. Patterns recorded without accusation. Each entry a quiet indictment building toward inevitability. And then the draft. At the sight of it, he inhaled sharply. Not denial. Recognition. His eyes flicked over the lines he had written. Evaluate emotional commitment, alternate support, predictable, emotional alignment, maintain rehearsed affect. And for the first time since the fracture began, He didn't try to hide. He didn't reach for excuses. He didn't rearrange his posture. He didn't adjust his tone. He simply exhaled slow and deliberate, the sound almost echoing in the quiet room. So he said, "You went looking." "No," I answered. "You left everything where I could find it." His eyes narrowed not in anger but in comprehension. He understood then that he'd built his own unraveling. Every detail, every oversight, every carefully engineered test created the architecture of his collapse. "What do you want?" he asked finally. The question came out too quickly, revealing more than he intended. He wasn't asking what I felt or what I needed. He was asking for the next step in the evaluation he believed he still controlled. But he didn't. I sat down calmly. "I want separation, not as a test, not as an evaluation, as a decision." He went very still. His expression didn't crumble. It didn't break. It simply emptied, like he was erasing one version of the script and searching for another. But none fit anymore. He couldn't salvage this moment with any rehearsed explanation. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low, steady. "No," I replied. "I'm ending one." The quiet between us settled deep, the kind of silence that finalizes something rather than suspending it. He didn't respond. The machinery of his manipulation, the calibration, the emotional assessment, the shifting narratives had nowhere left to anchor, nothing left to measure. After a long moment, he stood, straightened his posture, and left the room. His steps were perfectly even calculated to maintain control, but they landed with the weary precision of someone realizing control had already slipped beyond reach. As he disappeared down the hallway, the morning light caught the mirror shard on the table. A fractured reflection spread across the wall, split, sharp, beautiful in its clarity. It didn't tremble. It didn't distort. It held steady the way truth does once it's finally named. Morning settles differently when the truth has already done its work. It doesn't rush in. It doesn't demand attention. It simply arrives quiet, steady, unburdened, filling the edges of the house with a calm that feels unfamiliar and unmistakably mine. I wake before the alarm again, but this time the stillness around me doesn't feel like a threat or a test. It feels like space. The kind I hadn't realized I'd been losing in fractions over the past months, quietly replaced by Damien's calculations, his experiments, his curated illusions of closeness. The bedroom holds a softer light today. A muted beam extends from the window, cutting across the dim lamp on my bedside table. That lamp, object 12 in a chain I didn't consciously track until now, casts a gentle, warm glow that brushes against the hardwood floor. No sharpness, no fractured lines, just steady illumination, clean and unbroken. I sit for a moment on the edge of the bed, feeling the air shift around me with a kind of clarity I've never known in this space. No footsteps in the hallway. No tension coiled beneath the walls. No expectation of rehearsed warmth entering the room. The house exhales with me. I rise slowly, letting each movement sink into the quiet. The door opens without hesitation, and I step into a hallway no longer shaped by the pressure of unseen timelines. My footsteps echo softly, echoing with a freedom that feels almost fragile in its newness. The walls, once carrying the weight of his concealed intentions, seem lighter, as though they've been washed clean by the truth settling into every corner. In the kitchen, the counter catches the early light. The memory of the thin reflection that once slipped across its surface flickers briefly in my mind motif seed when everything was just beginning. But today the counter holds no warnings, no subtle fractures, no mirrored hints of something waiting to break. It's just a smooth, neutral plane reflecting the soft daylight of an ordinary morning. I make coffee without rushing. Without the quiet vigilance I developed over months of watching for Damien's moods, his posture, his tone shifts, his subtle tests. My hands move easily, grounded in the simple pleasure of routine for myself, not for reaction management or emotional assessment. As the machine hums, steam rises gently, carrying no weight other than its own warmth. I open the back door slightly, letting cool air drift into the kitchen. The breeze carries the faint scent of rain on soil, a reminder that days continue regardless of what truth emerges inside a home. I stand there for a moment, breathing in the cold air, as if tasting the morning for the first time. When the coffee is ready, I pour it into a mug and move to the living room. The evidence pile is gone sorted, filed handed off to the appropriate channels late last night, after Damien left in silence. There had been no argument, no raised voice, no plea for understanding, just a stillness between us that made the next step inevitable. He packed a few things. He didn't try to explain or negotiate once he understood the full architecture of his collapse. He just walked away quietly, like someone leaving the scene of a failed experiment. Now the table sits empty, clean, mine again. I pick up the dim lamp from the side shelf and set it gently on the coffee table, switching it on, even though daylight already fills the room. The combined light-warm artificial glow, mixing with muted natural brightness, grounds the present moment with a gentle finality. I lower myself onto the couch and let my eyes drift to the window. Outside, the sky opens in soft, pale tones, washed thin by early light. Clouds hang loosely across the horizon, not threatening, just present. The world feels wide again. My reflection appears faintly in the window's glass, soft, indistinct, framed by the dim lamp behind me. It isn't fractured. It isn't split. It doesn't distort, or shimmer, or warn. It simply exists, steady and whole. And the reflection holds steady when the truth finally does. I watch it for a long moment, letting the motif resolve settle into my chest with quiet certainty. For weeks, reflections had carried hidden meanings, fractures, slips, distortions that signaled something beneath the surface. But today, the reflection only reflects. It no longer holds secrets or shadows or contradictions. It holds me, clear and undivided. I sip the coffee, slowly savoring the warmth that spreads into my hands. The silence that once felt like a verdict now feels like an opening. A gentle, unoccupied space where no one is assessing my reactions. No one is crafting narratives around my expressions. No one is measuring emotional compliance or shaping the environment to test the elasticity of trust. The floor creaks softly beneath temperature changes in the house. Normal sounds, familiar. Sounds no longer charged with tension. I lean back into the couch cushions, feeling them soften around me in a way that invites rest rather than bracing. A small breeze pushes the window pane ever so slightly, creating a faint vibration in the glass. But the reflection remains steady. Not because nothing moves, but because the distortion that once lived beneath every moment is gone. I close my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion but out of peace. The first genuine quiet my body has recognized in months. When I open them again, the day has brightened. Sunlight expands across the room in a soft arc, illuminating the furniture, the corners, the bookshelves. The dim lamp glows beside it, unbothered by the presence of stronger light. Two sources of brightness, neither competing nor interrupting. Balance. A word I hadn't realized I missed. I rise from the couch, taking the dim lamp with me as I walk toward the hallway. I place it gently back on the bedside table where it belongs. The bedroom feels different now, with no unspoken weight settled into the sheets, no curated emotional temperature shaping my steps. The house is simply a house again, and I am simply myself. No one is watching my reaction. No one is measuring my hesitation. No one is adjusting their affect to influence my response. I stand in the center of the room and breathe deeply, the air filling my lungs with a clarity that doesn't hurt. The reflection on the window remains steady. The light holds. The quiet feels earned. Outside, the day begins, and for the first time in a long time I begin with it.